So let's take a look at multiplying decimals. When you're multiplying decimals, we're going to find a pattern to be able to understand the best process to do it. So if I was going to start with 9 times 2/10, well, I don't know how to do it yet, so I do know how to multiply by a fraction. So I'm just going to rewrite it as a fraction, 9 times 2/10. And then I'll do that work. Make that 9 over 1. 9 times 2 is 18. 1 times 10 is 10. So it is 18/10, which I will convert to 1 8/10. Now, since I'm working in decimals, I'm going to leave it as a power of 10. I'm not going to simplify. I'm going to rewrite that as 1 8/10. Let's do another example. This time, 8 times 2/10. Again, I'm going to do it as a fraction, because that I do know how to do. 8 times 2 is 16. 1 times 10 is 10. So I get 16/10. Again, I'm going to turn that into a mixed number, 1 6/10. And so I can write that as a decimal, 1 6/10. Now let's take a look at 7 times 2/10. Again, I have it here as a fraction already. 7 times 2 is 14. 10 times 1 is 10. I will convert that to 1 4/10, which I can write as a decimal, 1 4/10. Let's take a look at 3 more quick examples. 6 times 2/10. 6 times 2 is 12, so it's 12/10, which converts to 1 2/10. 5 times 2/10, which would be 10/10, which converts to 1 no tenths, since we're keeping it in our tenths. And then finally, 4 times 2/10. Well, that comes out to 8/10. And when I convert that, that is simply written as 8/10. Now, as we look for a pattern, when we look back here, notice we're multiplying by tenths on this whole page. These are all tenths. Our answer is always in the tenths place. So when multiplying a whole number times a decimal to the tenths place, the answer is in the tenths place. Now let's do a whole number times a digit in the hundredths place. So 3 times 3/100ths, well, that's going to be 9/100ths, which is 0.09 9/100ths. 4 times 3/100ths is 12/100ths, which is written like so. Let's do a couple more. 5 times 3/100ths is 15/100ths, which can be written this way. 6 times 3/100ths is 18/100ths, which is 18/100ths, and 7 times 3/100ths would be 21/100ths. Or written that way as 21/100ths. So remember, on this page, we did all multiplying by decimals in the hundredths place. And our answer was always in the hundredths place. So as a review, when we multiply a whole number times a decimal to the hundredths place, the answer is in the hundredths place. Now let's take a look at a decimal times a decimal. That is tenths times tenths. So if we do 4/10 times 6/10, I'm going to write those as a fraction, 4/10 times 6/10, and I'm going to get 24 hundredths, which I can write as 24 hundredths. If I do 4/10 times 7/10, I will get 28 hundredths. Five tenths times 7/10 will get us 35 hundredths. Notice we're doing tenths times tenths, but our answers are always coming out in the hundredths place. Let's do a couple more quick ones. 5/10 times 8/10 would be 40 hundredths. Which I would write as 0.40. Now you do know something about insignificant zeros, so I would actually write that as 4/10 for my final answer, but when I first did the calculation, it was 40 hundredths. 6/10 times 8/10 is 48 hundredths. And then finally on this page, 6/10 times 9/10 is 54 hundredths. Which we can write this way. Now remember on this page, we were looking at tenths times tenths, and our answer always came out to the hundredths place. And if we think about that, what's going on here in our decimal, in our fractions, 10 times 10 is that 100. So tenths times tenths is always going to be that hundredth. So last thing here is when multiplying a decimal to the tenths place times a decimal to the tenths place, the answer is in the hundredths place. Now, while we were doing that work, perhaps you noticed something while we were doing it. So let's do a couple of quick examples. Now, when I was doing my multiplication, I'm not going to do the multiplication with the fractions this time. I'm just going to be thinking to myself. What I'm really going to do is 7 times 6, which is 42. But since it's a whole number times a tenth, which is a whole number times a tenth, I know my answer is going to have a tenths place. So it's going to be 4 2/10. 4 hundredths times 7/10. Well, I know I'm going to get 28. 4 times 7 is 28. But if I do hundredths times tenths, I'm actually going to get thousandths. Well, how do I get thousandths? Right now, I just have 2 digits. I have to put a 0 here, and now I have 28 thousandths. To verify that, we could do this: 4 hundredths times 7 tenths. 4 times 7 is 28. 100 times 10 is 1,000. So let's take a look at 5 tenths times 8 hundredths. Well, 5 times 8 is 40. Again, I'm doing tenths times hundredths, which is thousandths. So I need to add in a 0, just like the problem before. Now we have that insignificant 0 again. So my final answer is 4 hundredths. Let's take a look at one more example. 5 tenths times 3. Well, 5 times 3 is 15. Since it's tenths times a whole number, I know my answer is going to include the tenths place. So my decimal point is going to go right there. So, simple way to do it is you do the multiplication. 6 times 8 is 48. And then you figure out the place value. Tenths times a whole, and you'll get tenths, and then you place in your decimal point.